this video, we are going to talk about error handling in the DataPower. Error handling has been a very important topic from the perspective of DataPower development. So how to deal with errors, how to handle them. These are some of the things that a developer is supposed to know. In this video, we are going to talk about this. This would be a multi-part video series because error handling is a complex topic and it cannot be dealt in just one video. Otherwise, it's going to be too long. So in the first part, we are going to talk about the basics of the error handling in DataPower. And in part 2 and part 3, we are going to build upon the material that we will learn in part 1. Without further delay, let's get started. To make this practical, rather than more of a theoretical interest, I have created a multi-protocol gateway here. You can see. And this multi-protocol gateway, it's very simple gateway. It's a loopback proxy. The objective of this multi-protocol gateway is to accept a client request, which is coming as a JSON. Then it tries to convert it into SOAP. Then it kind of mimics calling a backend service. The backend service gives us a response. The response is assumed to be a SOAP. We convert it into JSONX. And then we return the JSON data back to the caller. So the caller sends JSON and expects JSON. That is the basic thing here. Now here, whatever the policy that you see, let me open this policy in a new tab. So I'm going to open this policy in a new tab. And this is the policy. You can match the name. And here is the policy. Now, in order to focus on the error handling piece, I have tried to do some shortcuts over here. For example, the first processing action will convert incoming JSON to JSONX. The second processing action is going to convert JSONX to SOAP. The third processing action is supposed to mock calling a backend. So here I'm not trying to call a backend, rather I'm trying to inject some hard-coded values with respect to the employee information. And then next step would be to convert this JSONX into JSON. This one makes the proxy a loopback proxy and then returns the response back to caller. Here, since it is a loopback proxy, there is no response rule that you see. Response rule will anyways be not useful if I create it here. It will never be executed. So again, the focus is on the error handling. So first, let me show you how this service behaves. If I want to hit this service, I go to Postman. Here I put the URL http localhost 8002 and then some URIPs. I'm going to provide it some JSON like first name, last name, and then I say send. As soon as I send it, you can see that I'm getting HTTP response code 200 and we have some data out here, which is JSON. Good. So this is a working service. We need a working service in order to learn more about the error handling. Let's go back to the policy. Now, the way policy works is that all these processing action, they execute in sequential manners. First processing action happens, second one executes, third one executes, and so on. By default, this is the behavior. Now, if at all, one of these processing action gets errored out or results into an error, further processing actions would be skipped. DataPower execution framework will not execute future these processing actions. To show you this, I would like to inject the fault here. Here you see, I just dragged and dropped transform action. And to inject the fault, I have created an XSLT, which is called fault injection. If you want to see this XSLT, this is pretty simple. It simply uses DP reject, which is like a throw exception thing. Okay. Now click on done, click on apply policy. And now if I hit this multi-protocol gateway with the traffic, because of the fault injector, it is going to throw an exception. So let's send it. Now, to prove my point that it is indeed the processing actions after the fault injector. So here is fault injection. All the steps after this, they got skipped. To prove my point, you can go to show probe. And this last one is my current probe. Red color depicts that it resulted in an error, and you can see that it came to this JSON-X to SOAP and then fault injection, and future steps are skipped. Now that the fault injection has raised an error, how the error has been handled? Typically, errors are handled using something called error rule. But you can see that I have not created any error rule over here. So here is a learning part. DataPower by default defines an error rule. That error rule you will not be able to see in your policy. Consider it like a global error rule. The global error rule says that no matter where the error has happened in your policy, I am going to return HTTP response code 500 with a SOAP, which is simply says internal server error. So you see 500 internal server error, and you have a SOAP response coming back. And here you see the fault string. This is a custom error thrown from XSLT. This is coming right from the XSLT, which we have injected here. Let me show you. Go to the fault injector, click on view, and see this is the error that I'm specifying it over here. So DataPower has, consider it like DataPower has a default error rule configured. No matter whether you configure error rule in your policy or not, that default error rule is there, and it is going to take over whenever there is an error that happens in your policy. So that you have to remember. That is first thing. Second thing, now you have a liberty that you can create your own rule. For example, I can click on new rule. I can specify it as an error rule, and I can say that this is the error rule that I define. Now, once you define an error rule, the global error rule comes out of the picture. For a moment, it comes out. DataPower will keep it aside. And whatever error rule that you have defined here, DataPower is going to give it higher priority. So whenever an error happens, if your policy has an error rule, it will get a chance of execution. But here is a catch. Remember this. It may happen that in your error rule, you are doing some kind of processing which itself can return an error or can result into an error. If that happens, the global error rule will come into the picture, and DataPower will by default return this string that you saw over here. So that will happen in case your error rule itself results into an error. But for a moment, we'll keep that part aside. Now that we have defined an error rule over here, we have a liberty that we can define the custom error processing over here, which means that, take an example. In this case, the default error rule of the DataPower is returning an XML. This is inappropriate, right? Usually a client, if it sends JSON, it expects JSON. So it is really inappropriate for it to see an XML even in case of error. This may cause issues. So you might want to define something in the error rule which will return a JSON response in case of error. So what can we do for this? Maybe we can drag and drop transform. We can say, okay, I have an XSLT over here, which you can say custom error handler. Now I'll say make it null for a moment, and done. and this error is supposed to generate, so this XSLT is supposed to create a JSONX. You can see that it is creating a JSONX. Now I convert it to JSON. How? Very simple. Drag and drop transform action. Double click to open it. Go to store folder and you have a file, built-in file, which is called JSONX to JSON. Click on done and click on apply policy. So this is, now I have an error handler, custom error handler defined. This custom error handler is going to catch the error which is thrown from here. And in fact, even you're working with the response rule, even there is an error in the response rule, the control will go here. So no matter where the error happens, the control will go to error rule, your error rule over here. And this will ensure that client gets a JSON error back. So let us go back here and let's see. And now you can see that there is an error. Now understand this. This is the custom body that I have created in my error rule. This is not something that DataPower gave me. It is the custom body that I created. I am still getting HTTP 500 response code. If I want, I can customize this in my error rule. There are ways to deal with that, but if I want, I can customize it programmatically in my error rule. So that is certainly possible. And if I go back here, I see that I have my error rule, which generates some custom error body, and then it returns the data back to the caller, thereby satisfying the maybe interface agreement that, okay, the service on DataPower must accept JSON and must return a JSON response. Even in case of error, it must return a JSON error in the JSON format. So that is how it is working. This is simple understanding of error. I will summarize. You might have a request rule, you might have many request rules, many response rules, and you have an error rule. So the idea is that whenever an error is thrown from any of your request rule or response rule, the control will stop execution of future processing actions of that rule, and the control will go to the error rule, where the processing actions present in the error rule will execute, and whatever response is created is returned back to the caller. It is imperative for you to remember that you cannot transfer the control back from error rule to the previously executing rule. That you cannot do with the error rule. This is not permissible in the DataPower. So this is something to keep in mind. So this is one way in which you can deal with errors. Another way in which you can deal with errors is through the on-error action. How the on-error action works? The idea is that you drag and drop advanced here. I mean, you can drag it here as well. That's totally fine. But the reason why I'm saying drag it at the very beginning is because this on-error action, which I'm going to configure here, will look after processing steps that you see here. All these processing steps. And even in any one of them, the error happens. The control will not go to the error rule. The control will go to the on-error action. The on-error action will inevitably execute an error rule, but then you have a benefit. The benefit is that your control is still there. Your control is still there in this rule. So if you want, you can resume processing of future processing actions if you use on-error rule. That is the benefit of using on-error rule. How do you configure it? Simple idea. Double click to open it. Here you have on-error action. Click on that. In the next step, it is going to ask you for a processing rule. The processing rule would be an error rule. So you see that under the processing rule, only error rules are coming. So if you match the name error handling demo MPGW policy rule 2, this is exactly what you find at the bottom. Some of them are extra, which you don't see on this palette because I have created them before for some other demo, but it is what it is. Now here, it is important to remember that you have three modes here: cancel, alternative, and continue. And what I told you, if you want your future processing actions to continue, choose continue. In that case, whenever an error happens, the control will go to the on error action. By virtue of on error action, the processing rule will execute. Once the processing rule executes, the control will go back to your main rule. And in that main rule, all future processing actions will be tried for execution. So this is what happens when you have on error action. By default, the error mode is cancel, which means that by default DataPower will return the control back to this on error action, and once the on error action completes, DataPower will abandon executing future processing actions of the rule, request rule or response rule, wherever the error has happened, and it will return the data which is returned by your processing error rule over here. So that is the default action. But if you want to continue, you should choose the continue option. Here you have liberty to provide error input and output as well. By default, the error rule receives the input data. For example, let me remove it and look at the error rule. So by default here, this processing action will receive input data. What is input data in our case? In our case, the input data is this. So it will receive this data. This is the default behavior, unless you want to override that. For example, in this case, I have overridden it by specifying the input context as null. So these are the two main ways of doing the error handling in the DataPower. Now, I know that I have not done a good job by telling you all these facts, because these facts which I spoke about, it has raised more question in your mind than me providing you answers. So part 2 and part 3, I will try to answer some of them. But error handling, as you know, is a very complex topic, and there are many scenarios out there. Some of the questions that might be coming in your mind at the moment is that this is a very high level review, and maybe Ajitabh has skipped talking about how to deal with stack traces over here, or for example capturing the errors and dealing with many different types of errors, and so on and so on. So part 2 and part 3 would be dedicated for that. But part 1 I would like to conclude here in the interest of time. So thank you very much for watching this video. We'll learn more in part 2 and part 3 on the error handling.